Hey everybody, welcome to Never Stop Building. My name is Jason, and today we're going to be continuing the multi-part timber frame pergola build series. If you're just joining us, go ahead and check out the previous video where we demolished the old pergola, built the foundation, and then I was cutting apart foundation stones. And if you want to follow along and kind of see what these plans look like, I have those plans posted on Patreon for supporters of the channel. So let's get to it. So this video is going to be about preparing the main posts. So the pergola is supported half by the house and half by these two huge Port Orford cedar posts that are scribe fit to the foundation stones I worked on in the last video. So we're going to be turning these square timbers into hand-planed round timbers. It was a little tricky to get these into the shop space, but once they were in and on sawhorses, I could proceed in starting to do some of the initial layout. So I used one of my big timber saws to cut the ends basically square. I started by drawing center lines along the length. I used a level to establish a center point on the beam on both ends, and then I snapped lines down the sides and on the top at right angles to each other. So I have these center lines that define everything else along the length of the beam. And then I'm laying out an octagon because those are going to be the first cuts I make. I have the square and I'm going to divide it so that when I take off the corners, I have 8 even sides all the way around. Once I had laid out the octagon on both ends of the post, I could snap lines between those corners, and I had extended the lines of the octagon because the circle that the octagon defined was smaller than the total outside of the beam, so I extended all those lines for the octagon, and then snapped lines between those points, and then I could set this enormous beam saw at a 45-degree angle and carefully trim off those big triangles and turn the square post into an octagonal post. Obviously, I did not want to try to cut right to the line with this huge saw because it was somewhat of a rough cut. So I left myself a little bit of extra wood, and then I came back with my large 6-inch planer and planed down the rest of the material to get that octagon equal on all 8 sides. The next step is to take my little story pole here and lay out the next set of facets that would turn this into a 16-agon, whatever that is. And then it's a repeat of the first step, so snapping lines between all the vertices on the 16-sided shape. taking a power planer and trimming down those corners to create a new flat. So we went from 4 sides to 8 sides to 16 sides, and it's starting to look round. And then there is the third stage of creating facets, where I go from 16 sides to 32 sides. So again, snapping, laying out the shapes on both ends, snapping lines between both ends, and then power planing to create new facets. So you got a 32-sided circle here. And at this point, we're basically ready to turn it into a full round. And we're going to be switching to the hand plane, and it's a curved bottomed hand plane, and that is a very tricky thing to set up. So I'm going to have a whole separate video about setting up, sharpening, and preparing the curved hand plane to smooth out this post. So subscribe or look for the link here to see that video, but I don't want to distract from the post building. So assume that I've prepared my curved bottom hand plane for a very sharp cut, and now I'm going to basically be taking down those facets from 32, sort of knocking down the corners to 64, and it starts to disappear at that point, and you're focusing more on taking a consistent shaving all the way down the post with the curved blade, and you get it nice and sharp. It becomes a round post, and I'm sort of going in circles and checking it, and if it looks good, it is good, basically. This was my first round planed post. It's not easy. I think it turned out okay, but I've seen some that they do in Japan, and they are unbelievable. So at this point, I had basically a completely round set of posts for this pergola, and this wasn't the finished plane of these posts, but it was close enough to round that I could lay out and start doing the joinery cutting. So again, I laid out perpendicular lines on the end of each post and connected them with ink lines, so I had quadrants along the length of the post that I could use to lay out the joinery at right angles to each other. And the first thing I was going to do is get these posts scribed and oriented. And before I did any of that, I needed to get these bolt holes, because the engineer required that the posts be bolted down to the piers. So I ended up building a little wood jig to set along the bottom of the posts that would line up and allow me to position my big auger drill bit right in the center and drill a very straight hole up in the bottom of the post. The way these posts were going to get held down between the stones and the foundation piers is there's a product that it's a sleeve that you screw onto the top of the threaded rod, and then at a right angle to that sleeve there is an expanding bolt that basically will push down on the post and up on a slot inside the sleeve. So you only need an access hole in your side of your post. You don't have to create a large opening where you can get your hand in there with a large bolt, with a large nut and a washer and a wrench, and have the wrench move, sufficiently to tighten the nut. So all I needed to do was line up an access hole at the right distance, within some amount, because I can always cut that threaded rod a little lower, and I can adjust the height of that cross slot by threading the sleeve more or less onto the threaded rod. And it can be very helpful on these large timbers to use the earth as a reference surface. So I used a level to make sure that the vertical line on the end of my posts was plumb, and that way I could use a level to line up my jig and drill a perfectly vertical access hole down to intersect the hole that was going in the bottom of the post. So now I'll have that access hole. I can test fit the sleeve. And this both allowed me to test fit the sleeve and make sure the threaded rod would work and have this whole thing compress down when we do the install, but I needed the threaded rod to be in the post for the next stage, which is pulling the stone to the end of the post so we can scribe it in the shop. So while I was laying out to do the bottom cuts and make a flat bottom on these stones, I was figuring out what orientation I wanted them to sit on the site in relationship to the post. So sort of what was the show face and whatnot. And I put a mark on the stones. Basically, that would be the front mark or the side mark. And then I could also orient my posts themselves to have the nicest looking face, either facing the house or facing their jacuzzi out there. I'm not entirely sure where I put the best face, but once I knew where I wanted the post to sit against the stone, I could line everything up and start the scribing process. I built this right angle support structure that would sit on my height adjustable cart. And when I had the posts level and the threaded rod sticking out, and I had my stone perpendicular strapped to this right angle thing, I could jack up the stone, which was pretty heavy. I mean, I could lift them, but they were, I don't know, they were probably like 90 pounds or 100 pounds or something like that, kind of awkward. Slide the stone onto the threaded rod, tighten down a nut and a plate on the bottom of the stone to push it up against the post, and that I could do my initial scribing. As far as the scribing process itself, it's nothing special. The tool I use is a very inexpensive compass with a sharpened normal pencil in it, and I've bent the pointy part of the compass at a slight curve so that it can line up around the stone. I got my line all the way around and cut it with a knife to break the fibers so that there wouldn't be substantial chip out. And then I tried a bunch of different ways to remove the bulk of the waste. I started by using this carving chisel gouge to chip away most of the stuff around the edge so that there wouldn't be any blowout. I sawed away some of the material, and then eventually I just switched to my angle grinder with the carbide wood carving disc, which really does remove a lot of the material quite quickly. After the bulk of the material was removed close to the line, I used some of my smaller curved chisels to fine-tune that scribed edge. Then it was a matter of test fitting the stone. I put some chalk on the top of the stone and saw where it transferred to the underside of the post, and then I could relieve that area. I've said it before, what you want to have is you want to have the slightest dome underneath the scribed and have the edges sit on your stone, support the weight, but have a little bit of relief. So the edges will kind of crush a tiny bit, which ended up not mattering for this because we charred the bottoms of the stones for weather protection, and it kind of made the edge softer. But anyway, the edges kind of crush down and make a nice seal, and then you have a relieved, well-fit dome that does a lot of the support of the structure. It was very helpful having this wheeled cart for doing the test fitting back and forth, because it was just a matter of sliding the stone back and forth. I did a video on a porch I had done with a friend of mine, and we actually scribed them on site, and we had basically a winch attached to a man lift that we were pulling the posts up and down to get them finally fit. And I did not want to deal with that on this project, so it was nice to be able to scribe them laying down and just wheel the cart back and forth. As I got close to the end, there's me just kind of fine-tuning it, seeing little areas that hit, and you can kind of see in this view that it's a quite neat scribe to the bottom of the post to the bottom of the post. It's a quite neat scribe fit between the bottom of the post and the top of the foundation stone. After this first post was scribed to its stone, I followed the same process on the other post to the other stone. I did not film it because I was just cruising along. Once both posts were scribe fit and tight to their stones, that allowed me to get a very accurate measurement off the bottom of the stone surface, that flat surface I made in the last video. And as I explained, I knew I knew the distance between a reference line that we had on site and the top of the piers that we had poured. And knowing that distance and knowing the final height of this pergola allowed me to calculate how much off of that bottom of the stone the joinery was going to be on these posts. That's why I had to do all this scribing ahead of time, because once the flat stone created my reference surface, I offset my measurement and then cut all the joinery relative to that. And I did this on both posts, so that both of these dimensions were a little bit different. But once I had those reference lines, I could do all the layout. I dropped off the extra with a chainsaw and then finished with a handsaw to get a flat surface where I could do my secondary layout, which involved marking the tops of the posts with the tenon dimensions and then transferring those lines down to the tenon shoulder area. I scored along my layout lines to prevent tear out and then cut the tenon shoulders with a handsaw. Then I can rip the tenon shoulders, these are the wide shoulders, with a handsaw, remove that waste, and then fine-tune the mating surfaces with a slick and corner plane to get a very nice flat long shoulder on the tenon. All the joints on this pergola are going to be connected with these diamond pegs. So it was laying out, drilling out, and then chiseling the peg holes on the tenons. After the peg holes were cut, then I was just following my layout lines on the short shoulders to rip off the waste for that, then clean up the corners, chisel any extra out of the way, make sure that is all clean, do some chamfers on the feed edges so those tenons fit nicely in their mating mortises, and that tenon is complete on this post. The next joints to cut were the peg hole and mortise for the cross brace. So I started with the peg hole by drilling out the corners, then drilling out the center from both sides, and then chiseling to make a diagonal or a diagonally rotated diamond shape peg hole. And this needed to be straight, and it also needed to be clean on the insides and tight so that the peg, which would be exposed on both sides, would have a nice reveal. After the peg hole was cleaned up and finished, I moved on to the large mortise that would accept the through tenon. And this this had a little recess, which I'm going to cut in a minute, but same basic process. Drill out the corners, drill out the center, chisel out the waste from both sides, use various straight edges and chalk on a stick to make sure everything was clean and straight and true. And I had a test piece of wood that I hammered in to check the fit of the mortise. And this also served as a support surface so I could do the layout for this little pocket. There's a little pocket on the inside of each post that accepts the larger dimension of the cross member. The cross member seats into this pocket so that the cross member doesn't have to be scribe fit to the round of the post itself to have a clean fit. It's a lot easier to just have it seat against a square surface than make a convex shape around the area where that member seats against the post. So I used the test tenon as a surface to support my little palm router so I could remove the waste from the little pocket to my layout lines to have a consistent depth and an even cut all the way around, and then I could clean that all up with a chisel. What I probably did not film is I chiseled a square little mortise around that cross hole that holds the piece that attaches to the threaded rod that holds the whole thing down to the foundation, so that I could insert a little cover, a little plug after it was all assembled, and make that hole disappear. But after all this joinery was done, I moved on to the finish planing, where I sharpened up my plane and got that curve dialed in, and then planed off all the dirt and mess and chalk and layout lines, and had my finished piece. In order to protect the hand-planed surface, I taped around the joinery and then covered the whole thing in paper so it could be assembled without dinging up the nice surface or getting fingerprints all over it. And that completes the two main posts, which were a big substantial effort for this project. In the next installment of this series, we'll finish up the joinery and preparation of all the other members, the 4 main support beams and the huge cross beam and the lower cross beam. And we'll get all those hand planed and ready for install. So thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.